A single marriage proposal once shook the Roman Republic more than a battlefield defeat. Not because of love itself, Romans were practical about that, but because of who was allowed to marry whom. In 445 BCE, the Lex Canuleia quietly tore a hole in one of Rome's oldest social walls, legalizing marriage between patricians and plebeians. On paper, it was a modest reform. In reality, it was a legal earthquake that revealed how fragile aristocratic power really was when confronted with law, numbers, and stubborn social pressure. To understand why this law mattered so much, we have to step into early Republican Rome, a city obsessed with hierarchy. Roman society was divided into two broad legal orders: patricians, the old aristocratic families who monopolized priesthoods, magistracies, and political prestige, and plebeians, everyone else, farmers, artisans, traders, soldiers, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population. This wasn't merely a social distinction. It was written into law, ritual, and tradition. Who you could marry was a matter of state interest. Marriage as a political weapon. In Rome, marriage was never just about family life. It was about alliances, inheritance, legitimacy, and power. A lawful Roman marriage, iustum matrimonium, produced legitimate children who could inherit property, political status, and religious eligibility. Blocking intermarriage between classes ensured that patrician bloodlines, and more importantly, patrician privileges, remained uncontaminated. The ban itself came from the Lex Duodecim Tabularum, the famous 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code, mid-5th century BCE. Table 11 bluntly prohibited connubium, the legal right to marry, between patricians and plebeians. The justification was couched in religious and moral language. Patrician rituals were supposedly sacred, their bloodlines divinely sanctioned, and mixing them with plebeians would offend the gods. But this argument was thin even by Roman standards. Plebeians fought in Rome's wars, paid taxes, and filled the legions. Many were wealthy. Some were culturally indistinguishable from patricians. What they lacked was political recognition. The marriage ban was less about religion and more about preventing plebeians from gaining access to patrician networks of power through kinship. The conflict of the orders behind the law. The Lex Canuleia did not appear out of nowhere. It was a product of the long conflict of the orders, a centuries-long struggle between patricians and plebeians over political equality. By 445 BCE, plebeians had already won significant concessions: the tribunate, written laws, and some protection against arbitrary punishment. Yet one barrier remained deeply symbolic. If plebeians were truly citizens, why could they not marry fellow citizens? Gaius Canuleius, a tribune of the plebs, made this contradiction impossible to ignore. He proposed a law abolishing the marriage ban and, in the same political breath, demanded that plebeians be allowed to hold the consulship. The patrician response was immediate and hysterical. According to Livy, senators warned that Rome would collapse if social boundaries dissolved. They claimed monsters would be born, rituals corrupted, and the gods enraged. What they really feared was lineage. A patrician daughter marrying a plebeian meant grandchildren whose status would be legally ambiguous, and potentially plebeian magistrates with patrician blood. Law, once changed, could not be easily controlled. The Lex Canuleia itself. The Lex Canuleia did one thing, and it did it cleanly: it restored connubium between patricians and plebeians. From that moment, marriages across class lines were fully legal, and their children were legitimate Roman citizens. Notice what the law did not do. It did not abolish class distinctions. It did not open magistracies. It did not declare social equality. But Roman law has a way of working indirectly. Marriage created kinship, and kinship created political facts. This is why I consider the Lex Canuleia one of Rome's most subversive laws. It didn't shout revolution, it whispered inevitability. Aristocratic panic and moral theater. The senatorial debates recorded by Livy read like moral theater. Patricians framed the law as an existential threat, claiming that Rome's identity rested on pure, ancestral lines. This rhetoric is strikingly familiar. Throughout history, elites have often used marriage restrictions to preserve power while dressing exclusion up as tradition, morality, or divine will. What undermined their argument was lived reality. Plebeians were already serving as officers, marrying informally, and accumulating wealth. The law lagged behind society. The Lex Canuleia simply forced Roman law to catch up with Roman life. Immediate effects, subtle but real. In the short term, the effects were limited. Intermarriage did not suddenly become common. Social pressure, family expectations, and cultural snobbery remained powerful. Most patrician families still avoided plebeian matches. But legality matters. Once legal recognition exists, norms slowly adapt. Children from mixed marriages could inherit, participate in civic life, and, most dangerously for the aristocracy, claim legitimacy. Over time, this blurred the sharp legal line between the orders. Wealthy plebeians could now fuse their economic power with patrician prestige. Poor patricians, meanwhile, found themselves increasingly irrelevant. The long-term political consequences. Within decades, the logic of the Lex Canuleia resurfaced elsewhere. If plebeians could legally marry patricians, why couldn't they govern alongside them? The consulship opened to plebeians in 367 BCE through the Licinian Sextian laws. By the late Republic, the old patrician-plebeian divide had lost much of its political meaning. From a legal historian's perspective, the Lex Canuleia marks a turning point, the moment when Roman law stopped pretending that birth alone could sustain power indefinitely. Law as a social accelerator. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Lex Canuleia is how modern it feels. It recognizes something that lawmakers still wrestle with today: law cannot indefinitely enforce social segregation without eventually collapsing under its own contradictions. Marriage equality, whether in ancient Rome or the modern world, is rarely about marriage alone. It is about legitimacy, inheritance, recognition, and access. When you regulate who may form a family, you regulate the future composition of society itself. In my opinion, the Lex Canuleia deserves far more attention than it usually gets. It lacks the drama of assassinations or revolutions, but its impact was structural. It changed Rome not by violence, but by paperwork, and that is often how real power shifts happen. A quiet victory for the plebeians. Unlike later plebeian victories, the Lex Canuleia produced no immediate triumphal narrative. There were no statues, no festivals, no heroic martyrdoms. But it delivered something deeper: dignity under the law. By recognizing plebeian marriages as fully legitimate, even when paired with patricians, Rome acknowledged that citizenship could not be partitioned forever. Once that principle entered Roman law, the old aristocratic order was living on borrowed time. Why the Lex Canuleia still matters. The law reminds us that social barriers often persist not because they are natural, but because they are legalized. Remove the legal scaffolding, and the structure eventually collapses. Rome would go on to reinvent hierarchy in other forms: wealth, patronage, imperial favor, but the idea that birth alone could permanently define destiny was fatally wounded in 445 BCE. Sometimes history turns not on swords, but on who is allowed to marry whom.